A locked room, no way out, and the one person who knows exactly how to break her, learning for the first time how to be careful with her instead. We are about to hear this story right now. The classroom had not been used in years. That much was obvious from the quality of the silence inside it. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty room, but something older, more deliberate, like the silence between two notes in a song that hasn't been played in decades. Dust had settled on the desks in a thin, even layer, undisturbed. The blackboard still held half an equation in faded chalk, the letters crumbling at their edges as though even the words had grown tired of waiting. 3 candles burned in iron holders near the window, though no one had lit them. They simply burned the way things in Hogwarts sometimes did, because the castle decided they should. Hermione Granger noticed all of this in the span of approximately 4 seconds. Then she noticed Draco Malfoy. He was standing near the far wall, his back to her, his fingers pressed flat against the stone, as though he were reading something written in the texture of it. His robes were dark, slightly damp at the shoulders from the rain that had been falling since morning, and his hair, usually arranged with the kind of precision that suggested effort carefully disguised as effortlessness, had come loose at one side, a pale strand curving toward his jaw. He hadn't heard her come in, or he was pretending he hadn't. Hermione's first instinct was to leave. Her second instinct, arriving approximately half a heartbeat later, cold and practical, was to check whether she could. She turned back to the doorway. The door was there, heavy, arched, wooden, iron-banded, the same door she had walked through 30 seconds ago, following what she had been almost certain was the sound of a first year in distress somewhere in the eastern corridor. The door was there, and it was closed, and when she closed her fingers around the iron handle and pulled, nothing happened. She pulled again, both hands this time, her weight shifting back onto her heels. Nothing. It won't open. His voice came from behind her, low, flat, stripped of everything except the information itself. She didn't turn around. "I can determine that myself, thank you," she said, and cast Alohomora at the lock with perhaps slightly more force than was strictly necessary. The spell hit the door and dissolved. Not deflected, dissolved, absorbed into the wood the way water absorbs into old paper, leaving no mark, no resistance, simply nothing, as though the door had swallowed it. Hermione stared at the place where the spell had gone and felt the first real thread of unease move through her chest. She cast 3 more spells in quick succession. Bombarda, Reducto, a disillusionment reversal, in case the door was something other than a door. Each spell vanished. The door remained. The candles flickered once, briefly, as though registering mild interest in the proceedings, and then steadied. "I tried those." He was closer now. She could hear it in his voice, not close enough to crowd her, but no longer across the room. And about a dozen others. The wood doesn't respond. The hinges don't respond. The walls don't respond. A pause. "I've been in here for 20 minutes. Now she turned around. Draco Malfoy looked exactly as terrible as she might have expected someone to look after 20 minutes of failed wand work against an enchanted door. There was a sharpness to the line of his jaw that hadn't been there last year, a hollowness beneath his eyes that had nothing to do with the poor candlelight. The war had carved things out of everyone. In him, It showed in the places where something had been removed rather than added. Some softness around the mouth, some ease in the shoulders, something she didn't have a precise name for, but recognized as youth, simply, straightforwardly, gone. He was watching her the way he often watched her these days. 8th year had created a strange, specific tension between them. Not the old hostility exactly, which had possessed a kind of energy, a heat, something almost alive. This was different. This was the stillness of two people who had decided, separately, not to detonate. Who had looked at each other across the rebuilt Great Hall on the first day back, and understood, without speaking, that whatever they had been to each other before required renegotiation, and that renegotiation was exhausting, and that perhaps the simplest solution was a careful, sustained, mutual silence. It had worked, more or less, for 3 months. 20 minutes, she repeated. I wasn't counting. Estimate. She turned back to the door and pressed her palm flat against it. The wood was warm. Not the warmth of proximity to fire, but something else. A stored warmth, like stone in the late afternoon, like something that had been holding heat for a very long time. She felt it move slightly against her palm, the faintest suggestion of vibration, and pulled her hand back. It's alive, she said quietly. Brilliantly observed. Malfoy. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I am not in the mood. She heard him exhale, a short sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a scoff, something he seemed to deploy when he had a response ready and had decided at the last possible moment not to use it. She had noticed that sound before. She had started noticing it sometime around October, which was a fact she preferred not to examine. She turned and moved past him toward the center of the room, pulling her bag off her shoulder and setting it on one of the dust-covered desks. The motion of unpacking was calming, familiar, and she needed the familiarity. Her copy of Advanced Magical Theory, her notebook, her ink, her wand laid carefully to one side. She needed her hands to have something to do while her mind worked. Someone set this, she said, not to him precisely, more to the room. It's not an accidental enchantment. The castle does produce them occasionally, but they don't feel like this. This feels intentional, structured. Yes. He had sat down, she realized, on one of the old desks, not in the chair, on the desk itself, his long legs angled, his wand turning slowly between his fingers the way it did when he was thinking. I reached the same conclusion. Do you know anything about who? No. She looked at him. I was walking past, he said. I heard something. Came in. The wand stilled between his fingers for a moment. Same as you, presumably. The thought landed in the quiet space between them, and neither of them said anything about what it implied. That they had both been drawn here. That the something they had each heard had perhaps not been accidental. That this room, with its ancient silence and its burning candles and its door that swallowed spells, had been waiting for them specifically. Hermione sat down at the desk she'd claimed and opened her notebook to a clean page. Right, she said. Then we work the problem. She began to write. Observations, variables, the precise characteristics of each failed spell, the texture of the door's warmth against her palm. Her handwriting was quick and small and very even, the letters pressing into the parchment with an assurance that was mostly genuine. The scratch of the quill filled the room. From across the space, she was aware of Draco Malfoy watching her. She was almost always aware of Draco Malfoy. That was the other thing she preferred not to examine. It had begun, she thought, sometime in September. He had come back to Hogwarts with the particular composure of someone who had rehearsed it extensively, every gesture calibrated, every interaction minimal, the kind of careful personal containment that might have read as arrogance to someone who didn't know the difference. Hermione knew the difference. She had spent 6 years watching him perform arrogance. This was not that. This was something pressed down very hard from the inside, something held in place by a willpower that must have been, she suspected, exhausting. She had not expected to feel anything about that. She had not expected to find herself watching the way his hand moved when he was taking notes, or noticing that he took his tea without sugar, and that when something amused him, truly amused him, not the performed cruelty that had passed for wit before, a single line appeared at the left corner of his mouth before his expression could close over it. She had not expected any of it. The quill moved across the parchment. The candles burned. Outside the window, the rain continued its soft, patient percussion against the glass, and the sky was the specific grey of a November afternoon that has no intention of becoming evening, only darker versions of itself. "You're cataloguing," he said. "Obviously. You can't catalogue your way out of a sentient enchantment, Granger." She pressed the tip of her quill to a new line. "I can try." The silence stretched. She heard him shift on the desk, the old wood registering the movement with a faint creak. She did not look up. "What did you hear?" he asked. "When you came in? What sound drew you here?" The quill paused. It was a reasonable question, a logical question, the kind of question she herself would have asked in his position. And yet, something in the asking of it, the quiet directness of it, so unlike the careful verbal deflection that had characterized every brief exchange they'd had this year, made her feel the question as a different kind of thing entirely. "A voice," she said after a moment. "I thought it was a student." The rain touched the window. "I heard my name," he said, and offered nothing else. Hermione looked up. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on some indeterminate point near the blackboard, on the half-erased equation, on the ghost of someone else's abandoned work. The wand had stilled completely in his hands, and in the candlelight the line of his profile was very sharp and very still, like something cut from material that only looked soft. She looked back at her notes. Her handwriting, she noticed, had grown slightly less even in the last few lines. She straightened it, pressed on, wrote. The enchantment responded specifically to the presence of 2 people. Likely requires both subjects to participate in resolution. Nature of required resolution unknown. She underlined unknown twice. Then she sat with the word for a moment and felt, beneath the steadiness she was maintaining with considerable effort, the first real shape of something she wasn't ready to name. Not fear, precisely, and not anticipation, and not the sharp familiar friction of being near him, but all 3 of those things pressed together into a single awareness, warm and specific, like a hand against old wood. The door was warm. The candles burned. The room held them with the patient certainty of something that had made up its mind. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The candles had burned lower by the time Hermione accepted that her notes were not going to save her. she had filled 4 pages. 4 careful, precise, increasingly redundant pages in which she had documented every observable characteristic of the room, every failed spell, every textural detail of the door, the walls, the floor, the window glass, which was, she had noted, not quite transparent in the ordinary sense, but carried a faint iridescence at its edges, like the inside of a shell, like something that had once been alive and still remembered it. She had written about the candles, which had not diminished in the way candles should, their wax columns remaining stubbornly, impossibly constant. She had written about the temperature of the room, which was warmer than it ought to be given the November rain pressing against the glass and the absence of any visible fireplace. She had written, in very small letters at the bottom of the 4th page, and then immediately scratched out, "The room knows we're here." She had scratched it out because it was not a useful observation. Because it was the kind of thing you wrote when your careful, analytical mind had run out of more useful things to say and had started producing impressions instead of data. Because it was, despite being scratched out, almost certainly true. She set the quill down, pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and breathed. When she lowered her hands, Draco Malfoy was looking at her. He looked away immediately, not with guilt, precisely, but with the specific speed of someone who has made a decision a fraction of a second too late. She filed this away without intending to. Her mind did that with him, collected details without her permission and stored them somewhere she couldn't quite reach. 4 pages, he said, to the middle distance. Yes. And the enchantment is layered. She straightened her already straight quill on the desk, aligning it with the edge of the notebook. There's a containment layer. That's what's holding us in. But beneath it, there's something else. Older. The containment is recent, or at least deliberate and specific to us. The other layer is something the room already had, something it was built around. He was quiet for a moment. A purpose. A function. She looked at him directly, because looking away felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. Some rooms in Hogwarts were built for specific things, not classrooms originally, something else. Resolution chambers, mediation spaces, the old wizarding tradition of bound arbitration. His voice had shifted slightly, not warmer, but more present, the quality of his attention changing in a way she could almost feel from across the room. I know what they are. Then you know how they work. A pause. Outside, the rain moved through a brief intensification, drumming harder against the glass, then settling again. They work, he said, each word placed with the care of someone diffusing something, when both parties choose to use them, or when someone chooses for them. The words sat in the air between them. Hermione watched him absorb them, the slight tightening across his brow, the way his gaze moved to the door and then back, the barely perceptible adjustment of his jaw that meant he had arrived at the same conclusion she had, and disliked it with the full force of his considerable capacity for displeasure. Someone locked us in here on purpose, he said. Someone locked us in here, and the room will hold us until we... She stopped, chose the next word with precision. Until whatever it requires is satisfied. Reconciliation. The word came from him like something dropped from a height. Flat, almost expressionless. That's what bound arbitration requires. Not agreement, not a signed document. Actual reconciliation. Yes. He stood up from the desk. The movement was controlled, unhurried, the kind of motion that required effort to make look effortless. And he walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the rain-dark grounds, the distant tree line of the forbidden forest smudged to grey by the weather. Hermione watched the set of his shoulders and said nothing. This was the thing about Draco Malfoy in 8th year. Before, in all the years before, in the years when he had been the sharp edge of every corridor, the specific gravity around which certain kinds of cruelty organized themselves. Before, she had never had to think about what his silences meant. They had not been silences that required interpretation. They had been absences of cruelty, nothing more, gaps between one wound and the next. Now his silences were different. Now they had weight and texture, specific shapes that her mind, against her better judgment, had begun to learn. This one meant he was thinking about something he didn't want to say. "We could simply wait," he said finally. "See if it releases on its own." Bound arbitration chambers don't release on their own. They've been known to hold occupants for weeks. She paused. "There are documented cases." "Of course there are. Of course you know that." "Malfoy, I'm not." He stopped, started again with greater control. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just..." Another pause, longer. The rain moved against the glass in long, irregular patterns. "Weeks. It won't be weeks." She didn't know why she said it. It might be weeks. She had no particular evidence that it wouldn't be weeks. But something about the specific quality of how he'd said the word, flat, emptied out, like a room after furniture has been removed, made her want to take it back from him. The weeks. Return something less bleak in its place. He turned from the window. The look on his face was not the one she expected. She had braced, without quite realizing it, for the old armor, the slight elevation of the chin, the cooling of the eyes, the performance of a disaffection so complete it almost passed for genuine. What she got instead was something unguarded, brief, lasting perhaps 2 full seconds before his expression reassembled itself, but real, something tired, something that had nothing left to spend on pretense just at this particular moment. Then it was gone. The composure returned, settling over him like water finding its level. "You said whoever did this chose us specifically," he said. "The containment layer is keyed to us. It would have released if anyone else had walked through that door. It only holds for the 2 of us." His gaze moved across the room, not landing on her exactly, moving near her, around her, the way light moves around an obstacle. Who would do that? It wasn't quite a question. Hermione thought, Harry, Ron, Ginny, any one of 4 or 5 people who have mentioned in varying degrees of subtlety and frequency that the careful mutual silence between you and Malfoy makes the air in the 8th year common room feel pressurized. She thought, anyone who has watched us not look at each other for 3 months and decided the not looking requires intervention. She said, "I have some theories. I imagine you do." He pulled out his wand again, not to cast anything, just the habitual motion, something to do with his hands. "And you're not going to tell me?" "Not until I'm certain. Because certainty is important." "Yes." He looked at her then, fully, directly, in the way he usually didn't. The candle light was between them, casting the room in warm amber that made everything look softer than it was, and his eyes in that light were a shade of grey she didn't have a precise word for. Not silver, which was too bright, not slate, which was too dull. Something in between those things that she had definitely not spent any time considering. Granger, he said. Her name in his mouth this year had become something different from what it had always been. Last year, it had been a weapon. Every year before that, it had been a small, deliberate cut. The way he shaped the consonants, the way he didn't quite say it so much as deploy it. Now it was simply her name, shaped normally like he'd had to practice removing everything else from it, like the removal had taken effort. "What?" she said. "The room needs reconciliation." He said the next words with great precision. "We don't know each other well enough to reconcile." The statement landed between them, and she sat with it for a moment and recognized with some reluctance that he was not wrong. Reconciliation required something to be worked through, acknowledged, named. And what existed between them, what had existed for 7 years, and what existed now in different, stranger form, had never been named, had been performed, had been felt, had been carried in the body and in the particular register of heartbeat that accompanied certain corridors and certain proximity and certain silences, but never named. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "that's where we start." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely visible, but there, a fractional yielding, like the first movement in something long held rigid. "You want to talk?" he said. "I want to get out of this room." She held his gaze. Those two things might require each other. The wand turned once between his fingers. The rain persisted. The candles held their impossible, patient flame. "About what, specifically?" he said. Not a refusal, not an agreement, a waiting. Hermione thought about the many careful, precise answers she could give, the logical entry points into the history between them, the academic, the political, the publicly documented. She thought about Hogwarts in wartime, and what it had looked like, and what they had each done inside it, and what it had cost. She thought about all the clean, principled places to begin. Then she thought about the first day of 8th year, when she had walked into the rebuilt Great Hall and seen him standing at the Slytherin table alone, not eating, his hands braced against the wood, looking at the high ceiling with an expression she hadn't been able to name and still couldn't, and how she had stood in the doorway for a long moment watching him before Harry said her name and she had looked away. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not a fact, not an explanation, something true." The wand stilled. The room held its breath, or she held hers. She couldn't separate the two entirely, standing in the warm amber light with the rain at the window and 4 pages of notes that hadn't solved anything, and this person across the room from her, this specific, complicated, exhausting, unexpectedly present person, watching her with grey eyes that had learned to keep their secrets. "I didn't want to come back," he said, quietly, no inflection. "To Hogwarts. I didn't think I had the right." She had not expected that. The bluntness of it, the absence of any protective framing. She said, just as quietly, "What changed your mind?" His jaw moved. Something passed across his face and was swallowed before she could read it fully. He looked at the blackboard, at the crumbling equation, at the someone else's abandoned work. "I'm not sure I can answer that," he said, without answering several other things first. The candle nearest the window guttered in some unfelt draught, and then steadied. Hermione reached for her quill, and then did not pick it up. "Then answer those first," she said. The chalk equation on the blackboard had been bothering Hermione for the better part of an hour. Not because it was incomplete, though it was, the right side trailing off into a smear where someone's sleeve had caught it, the conclusion erased before it could be reached. It bothered her because she recognized the notation. Fourth year arithmancy, the foundational work on magical resonance between paired variables. She had written nearly identical equations herself, at 14, in a notebook she still had somewhere at the bottom of her school trunk. The room, she was becoming increasingly certain, was not accidental in any of its details. Draco had moved again. He did that, migrated through the space in slow, irregular intervals, as though staying in one place too long felt like a concession he wasn't ready to make. Currently, he was near the back wall, sitting on the floor with his back against the stone and his long legs stretched out before him, his robes pooled around him, his head tipped back at an angle that looked like exhaustion and probably was. His wand lay across his knee. His eyes were open. He had answered 3 things. She had not interrupted once. The first, he had returned to Hogwarts because his mother had asked him to, and because he had discovered, sometime during the long, terrible months after the war, that refusing his mother anything felt impossible in a way it never had before. This he delivered with the flat precision of a man reading from a report about someone else. And she had listened and heard beneath the flatness a frequency of feeling she didn't try to interpret yet. The second, he had taken his meals alone for the first 2 weeks, because the Great Hall produced in him a physical response he couldn't fully control. A tightening across the chest, a narrowing of the peripheral field, the particular full-body alertness of someone who had spent too long in places where the wrong expression could constitute a catastrophic error. He had said physical response with faint distaste for his own confession, and she had noticed that his thumb had pressed hard against the silver ring on his right hand while he said it, the skin around the nail going briefly pale. The third, he had noticed her the first day back, standing in the doorway of the Great Hall. He had said this, looking at the blackboard, not at her, his voice stripped to its simplest register. He had been looking at the ceiling, he said, because he could not look at the tables, at the gaps in them, at the particular arrangement of who was absent. And then he had felt, with a specificity that he did not explain, and she did not ask him to, that someone was watching him, and he had looked toward the door, and it had been her. And then, he said, he had felt something he also did not explain. Hermione had sat with that unfinished sentence for several minutes now, and was doing her level best not to examine it too closely. "You said several other things," she said. Her voice came out more careful than she intended, each word placed with the delicacy of someone crossing uncertain ground. "You've answered 3. From his position against the wall, Draco turned his head toward her. The candlelight reached him unevenly from this distance, illuminating the left side of his face and leaving the right in shadow, and the effect was disorienting. Half familiar, half something she didn't have a map for. "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not rushing you." "I know you're not." He looked back at the ceiling. That's somehow more difficult. Hermione opened her mouth and then closed it, straightened the notebook in front of her, already straight, ran her thumb along its edge, feeling the slight roughness of the parchment's tooth. Outside, the rain had eased from its earlier insistence into something softer, more continuous, a sound like breathing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." She recognized the construction. It was not a guarantee of an answer. She asked anyway. "Did you ever think about what you said to me, specifically? Any of it?" The question was too large, and she knew it even as she said it. She had meant to be more precise, had meant to choose one specific incident and locate it with coordinates and examine it clinically, the way she examined everything. Instead, it had come out whole and shapeless and honest, the way questions did when you had been holding them for several years. Draco was quiet for long enough that the rain filled the silence twice over. "Yes," he said. One word. She waited. "Not the way you might expect," he added slowly, like someone lowering themselves into cold water. "Not, I didn't catalogue them. I didn't make a list. It wasn't organized." A pause. His thumb found the silver ring again. "It was more that certain things would—" He stopped, started differently. "There was a period after everything, where I wasn't sleeping much and everything was very quiet and things would arrive. Not memories exactly, fragments, the specific weight of certain moments." Hermione looked at him. He was not looking at her. His jaw was tight in the way that meant he was continuing because he had decided to continue, not because it was easy. "Your face," he said, "in third year. When I said what I said. I've thought about that, specifically, the exact look." His voice was very even. "I was 15, and I thought cruelty was the same as strength, because I'd been raised in an environment that hadn't distinguished between the two particularly carefully, and I said something unforgivable, and I felt powerful for approximately 6 seconds, and then something in your face." He stopped again. Hermione realized she was holding very still, not artificially still, the kind of stillness that happens when the body decides, without consulting the mind, that any movement might disturb something that needs to be heard. "Something in my face," she said softly. "You didn't cry." He said it almost to himself. I had calibrated for a specific response. "You didn't give it to me. You looked at me like I was something." A long pause. The silver ring caught the candlelight. "Like I was something that had disappointed you, not hurt you, disappointed you, like you'd expected more." His breath came out slowly. "I was 15, and I told myself I didn't care. I thought about it for 9 years." The room held very still around them. Even the rain seemed to quiet itself, pulling back to the faintest whisper against the glass. Hermione looked at the equation on the blackboard. At the incomplete right side, the erased conclusion, the ghost of someone else's work. She thought about being 13 and standing in a cold corridor with her face burning and her throat closed, and the specific dignity she had gathered around herself like a cloak, refusing to let him see a single thing that he had aimed for. She had been so certain at 13 that refusing to react was the same as being untouched. "I wasn't disappointed," she said. "I mean, I was, but that's not—" She pressed her thumb against the edge of her notebook. "I was hurt. I was very hurt. I just wasn't going to show you that." "I know." His voice was quiet. "I know that now. You couldn't have known then. No. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. But I should have been less pleased with myself for causing it, whatever I thought I saw. Hermione looked at him. He was still facing the ceiling, still not meeting her eyes, and she was grateful for that. The not meeting made it possible to keep looking, to take in the sharpened angles of him, the carefully contained exhaustion, the thumb pressing against the silver ring with a pressure that was becoming a kind of language she was learning to read. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Evidently. I've never told anyone this." She pressed the words out carefully, each one considered. "6th year. When things were clearly very wrong with you. When you looked like you weren't sleeping and you were losing weight and something was obviously happening that you were carrying completely alone." She stopped, organized the next sentence. "I watched you. I noticed. And I told myself it wasn't my concern because you had given me no reason to make it my concern." Something changed in the quality of his stillness. "But," he said, "but I noticed, and I was—" The word arrived before she could evaluate it. "Frightened. Not of you. For you. And I've thought about it since, and I still don't entirely understand it, and I found it easier not to examine it too closely." Silence. Then, very carefully, as though the words required structural support. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you told me something true." She looked at her hands on the notebook. "And the room requires—" "Don't." His voice was not harsh. It was the opposite of harsh. It was stripped of everything sharp and left with something almost raw underneath. "Don't tell me it's because of the room. You had a choice about what to say. You made one." She had. She sat with the fact of that. "Yes," she said. "I made one." He moved then. Not much. Shifted against the wall, his head coming forward from the stone, his eyes finally moving from the ceiling. He looked at her across the amber-lit space between them, across the dust-covered desks, and the patient candles, and the 4 pages of notes that had solved nothing, and the quality of that look was something she felt in her sternum, specific and warm and very serious. "We were terrible to each other," he said. "You were worse. Yes. No deflection, no qualification. Significantly." Something loosened in her chest. Not everything, not most things, but something specific and long-held, a small anchor she hadn't fully recognized until it shifted. She breathed around it, let the loosening settle. "Do you want to sit over here?" she asked. The question surprised her slightly, arriving before she had authorized it. "It's warmer near the candles." He looked at the candles, looked at the desk she occupied, the space beside it. His expression moved through something she didn't catch fully. "I'm fine where I am," he said. "I know. I'm offering anyway." Another pause. The rain whispered. The candles held their steady, impossible light. He got up from the floor with the fluid economy of someone who had once been a seeker, all controlled extension, no wasted motion, and crossed the room. Not to the desk beside hers, to the desk in front of hers, which he turned slightly so it angled toward her rather than toward the blackboard, and sat down and set his wand beside him with the careful deliberateness of something being put down rather than set aside. The candlelight reached both of them now, even and warm. He looked at the equation on the blackboard. "Arithmancy," he said. "4th year, resonance between paired variables." "I was dreadful at arithmancy." "I know. You were better at potions. You were better at everything." The words came out without apparent premeditation, and he blinked once, very slightly, as though registering them a moment after they left him. Hermione looked at her notebook. The edge of her mouth moved in something she kept small and controlled. "Don't tell anyone," she said, "but I was dreadful at astronomy." A beat of silence. "You got an E on the practical," he said. "I saw the posted grades. E is not an O. E is exceeds expectations. It's not outstanding." The line appeared at the left corner of his mouth, the one she had catalogued without meaning to, sometime in October. It lasted 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then he looked at the blackboard again, and the line faded, and he said, "What do you think the equation was solving for?" Hermione looked at the incomplete notation, at the erased conclusion, at the paired variables on the left side, balanced and waiting. "I think," she said slowly, "it was solving for what happens when two things with opposing charges occupy the same space." His gaze moved from the blackboard to her. The candle between them held its flame absolutely still. Sleep, it turned out, was not something the room had opinions about. Hermione discovered this sometime past midnight, or what felt like midnight, the castle's specific quality of night silence having settled through the walls the way cold settles through old stone, slowly and completely. When her head dropped toward her notebook for the 3rd time, and she caught herself against the edge of the desk with a jolt that rattled her inkwell. Draco, from the desk angled toward hers, did not comment. This restraint was, she was beginning to understand, its own form of consideration. She looked up. He was awake, his robes drawn closer against the shift in temperature that had come with the deep hours, his wand lying untouched where he had placed it. He was reading, or appearing to read, a slim volume she didn't recognize, its spine cracked in a way that suggested long familiarity, the pages handled to a particular softness. He held it at an angle that caught the candlelight, and the light caught the pale architecture of his hand, the curve of fingers against the worn cover, the silver ring throwing a small crescent of reflection onto the desk's surface. She had been watching him for longer than she intended before she realized she was doing it. "There's nothing to lie on," she said, somewhat unnecessarily. The room contained desks and chairs and the cold flagstone floor and nothing else. "Observed," he said, without looking up from the book. "I'm not complaining. I'm—" She paused, noting. "Also observed." She pushed back from the desk and stood, stretching the compression from her spine, feeling the specific ache of hours spent hunched over parchment. The candles had not diminished. The rain had not ceased. The room existed in its same patient amber suspension, holding them with the absolute confidence of something that had made a decision and had no anxiety about seeing it through. She walked to the window. The grounds below were invisible beneath the dark and the weather. Only the faintest luminescence where the lake should be, and the black mass of the forest, and the rain drawing its long silver lines down the glass. She pressed her forehead very lightly against the cold pane and let the contrast of it, cold outside, warm within, move through her for a moment. Behind her, she heard the soft close of the book. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep well," said without self-pity. A statement of fact, offered the way he'd been offering things all evening, stripped of performance, simply placed between them for whatever use she might make of them. She turned from the window. He had set the book face down on the desk and was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read in the candlelight. Not closed exactly, but careful. The particular carefulness of someone who has been saying true things for several hours and is monitoring the structural integrity of the process. "Since when?" she asked. His fingers found the silver ring. "Since always, more or less. Worse since afterward. Since the war." She had learned over the course of this strange amber evening to hear his silences as precisely as his words. The pauses around certain time periods. The way afterward had become a single word that contained an entire history he moved around rather than through. "What do you do?" she asked. "When you can't sleep?" He looked at the book. "Read, usually. Sometimes I walk. The castle at night is—" He paused, choosing. Quieter, more itself, less occupied by everyone's requirements of it. She understood that. She had spent many nights walking the corridors herself, though she had never thought about it in quite those terms. Less occupied by everyone's requirements. She turned the phrase over and found it fit something she hadn't had words for. She crossed back to her desk and instead of sitting in the chair, lowered herself to the floor beside it, her back against the desk's side, her legs folded. The stone floor was cold, but not unbearable, and there was something relieving about the change of position, the different relationship to gravity. After a moment, she heard him move. He came around his desk and sat on the floor across from her, not close, the distance between them still several feet of flagstone, with his back against the opposite desk, and his legs stretched out at an angle, and his wand in his hand again, turning slowly. They were below the direct candlelight now, in the warmer shadow beneath the desk's level, and the room looked different from here. Larger, the ceiling higher and more ornate than she'd registered from the chair, the carved stonework along the upper walls catching the candle's movement in slow amber shifts. "I used to come to the library," she said, "at night, in the early years." "I know. I saw you once. Second year. You didn't see me." She looked at him. "What were you doing in the library at night in second year?" The wand slowed. Something crossed his face that took her a moment to identify as faint embarrassment, quickly managed. "Reading." "Reading what?" A pause. "Magical creature compendiums. My father didn't. There weren't many books like that at the manor. He considered the subject insufficiently serious. The word father had the particular weight it always carried when he used it. Not grief, not quite, but something densely textured. Multiple things pressed into a single syllable. "Which creatures?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment as though checking whether the question was sincere. "Thestrals, mostly," he said. "At the time, I couldn't see them, and it seemed important to understand what I was missing." A pause that lasted exactly one breath. "Later, I could." The sentence ended there, and he did not continue it, and she did not press it. She understood what it meant to be able to see thestrals. She had learned that understanding herself in a corridor of this same castle in the 5th year, and it had settled into her like a stone into still water, down and down, and resting on the bottom of something deep still there. "I used to read everything," she said, "in those night hours. Not for school, just everything. The library had books I'd never have reached if I'd been limited to daylight and assigned reading. There was a section in the back, restricted not for dark content, just for age, for maturity, and Madame Pince eventually stopped turning me away from it. "How old were you?" "3rd year. 13. The line appeared at the left corner of his mouth, brief and involuntary. Of course she did. "There was a book on magical bonds," Hermione said. "Memory charms and counter-charms, binding enchantments and their historical use." She looked at the ceiling, at the carved stonework. Bound arbitration chambers had a section, not long, 7 pages. I remember reading it and thinking it was one of the most, the word I used in my head was elegant. The idea that you couldn't legislate reconciliation, couldn't force it through any ordinary pressure, but that a space could be created that simply held 2 people until something real happened. "Held them," he said, "not forced them." "Exactly." She looked at him. The book was very clear about that distinction. The room doesn't produce reconciliation. It creates the conditions. The rest is... it's not magic, technically. It's the people. It's the people. He was quiet for a moment. The wand turned once, then stilled. "And if the people can't? The documented cases?" She stopped herself. He wasn't asking about documented cases. She tried again, more honestly. "I don't know. I think..." She pressed her back more firmly against the desk. "I think the room is patient, and I think genuine reconciliation always requires a threshold, something that has to be crossed." "What threshold?" "I think you have to want the other person to be all right." She said it slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Not forgive them completely, not agree with them, not... It's not about resolution of every grievance. I think it's about reaching a point where you genuinely want the other person to be intact, present, not erased." The silence after this was different from the previous silences. It had a different specific gravity. "I want that," he said, very quietly, not looking at her. Her heartbeat did something irregular. "I want that too," she said. The rain moved against the window. The candles burned. Somewhere deep in the castle's stone, something settled. The building's enormous, patient breath. "Tell me about your parents," he said, unexpectedly. She looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to," he added quickly. Quickly for him, which was still measured, still controlled, but carried an edge of something that might have been anxiety about having overstepped. "No, She pushed her hair back from her face. "It's not a comfortable subject." "I know. Mine either." A pause. "That wasn't why I asked. I asked because..." He seemed to find the reasons somewhere and lift it carefully. "You gave them up. You made them safe by removing yourself from them. And I've thought about that. What that costs." She had not expected him to know about that. It wasn't secret, precisely, but it wasn't widely discussed. The specific mechanics of what she had done, the memory charm, the new identities, Australia, existed in the part of the war's story that she hadn't written down. "Harry told you?" she asked. "No one told me. I read the trial documentation from the ministry. After." His eyes met hers directly. "I read everything I could find from afterward, about what people had done, what it had cost." His voice was very even. "I was trying to understand what I had been adjacent to, what I had allowed, what I should have, what I could have." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Draco," she said. His name in her mouth felt different than it had this morning. This morning she hadn't said it at all. His eyes moved to hers at the sound of it. "You were 17, she said. "So were you." "It's different." "Is it?" Not a challenge, a genuine question, delivered with the gravity of someone who has spent considerable time with it. "Yes," she said. "Not in every way, but in the way that matters here, yes. The choices available to you weren't the same as the choices available to me." Something moved across his face, something that wanted very much to argue and was, with visible effort, choosing not to. Because, she understood suddenly, he had been arguing this point with himself for 2 years and was exhausted by it, and was perhaps, cautiously, willing to hear another position. "My parents are safe," she said, shifting toward him slightly, feeling the flagstone cold through her robes. "They came back. They're home. They remember everything now." A breath. "It took months after the war, and the first few times I saw them, they looked at me like they were still reassembling who I was. Like I was a picture that had been taken apart and they were finding the pieces again." He said nothing, but his attention was absolute, the kind that has no room in it for anything else. "My mother held my face in her hands," she said, "the first time she remembered completely, and she looked at me and said my name and cried, and I—" She stopped. The memory was still sharp-edged, still capable of arriving in her throat and closing it. I hadn't cried. Through almost everything, I hadn't cried. And then I cried for approximately 40 minutes on my mother's kitchen floor. The silence after was very soft. "Good," he said finally. Just the one word. She looked at him. "That you had that," he said quietly. "That it was there to come back to." The candlelight moved between them, warm and unsteady. His face in it was open in a way she had never seen it in daylight, in the populated world, in the castle's ordinary hours. The careful architecture of his composure still present, but with something beneath it visible. Something younger, something that had not entirely abandoned the capacity for feeling, that had been submerged rather than removed. She reached across the space between them without deciding to. Not far. Her hand moved to the flagstone halfway between them and rested there, palm down, on the cold stone. He looked at her hand, at the flagstone, at the distance remaining. Then he looked at her face, and she held his gaze and did not look away. The candle nearest to them threw a long, quiet shadow across the floor between their hands, and the rain laid itself gently against the glass, and the room held them in its amber patience, and something that had been suspended for a very long time shifted in the air above the cold stone floor and waited to see what would happen next. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. The flagstone between them held the candlelight in a dull, uneven gleam. And Hermione was aware of her own palm against the cold stone with a specificity that crowded out almost everything else. The precise temperature of it, the slight roughness of the ancient surface, the fact that her fingers were relaxed rather than braced, open rather than held. She had not planned the gesture. It had arrived from somewhere beneath planning, beneath the careful architecture of her usual self-governance, and now it existed between them and could not be unexisted. Draco was looking at her hand with an expression she could not fully read from this angle. Not alarm, not the cool deflection she might have expected 48 hours ago, or 48 days ago, or in any of the years before this strange amber room and its patient enchantment. Something more complicated than alarm. Something that moved across his features the way weather moves across open ground, visibly, but faster than you can track its origins. His wand lay on the stone beside him. He had set it down at some point she hadn't registered, and this struck her now as significant in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. Draco Malfoy did not put his wand down. Not this year. She had noticed it without meaning to. The way it was always present, always within reach, always between him and the world in some functional sense, even when he wasn't holding it. A talisman, a control point, something that meant I can manage whatever arrives. It was lying on the flagstone 3 inches from his knee. "You're cold," he said, not quite a question, looking at her hand on the stone. "A little." He reached, the motion unhurried, deliberate, the kind of deliberateness that means each centimetre is a decision, and placed his hand on the flagstone beside hers, not touching. The distance between their fingers was perhaps 2 inches of cold grey stone, and the candlelight reached both of them unevenly, and neither of them spoke. It was, Hermione thought, possibly the most charged 2 inches of space she had ever occupied. She could feel the warmth of his proximity from here, that specific radiation of another body's heat across a small distance, which the cold of the room made more distinct, the way a candle is most visible in deep dark, the way a sound carries further in perfect silence. His hand on the stone was pale, long-fingered, the knuckles carrying faint evidence of some old damage along the right side that she had never noticed before, or had noticed and filed somewhere she hadn't accessed until now. "Tell me about the book," she said. He looked up from their hands. "The one you were reading," she clarified. "Earlier." A pause in which she could see him calibrate, deciding, she thought, whether to deflect or to offer. The calibration took less time than it would have 3 hours ago. Something had shifted in the economy of what he was willing to give, and she felt the shift as a warmth that had nothing to do with proximity. "Poetry," he said. She had not expected that. "Whose?" "Rilke." He seemed to brace slightly for her response. "German. Translated. My mother, she studied it at school before. She used to read it aloud sometimes in the evening when I was young enough that I fell asleep to it." His voice stayed level. "I don't know if I actually like it, or if I like what it sounds like inside a memory." Hermione sat with this for a moment, with the image it produced, a younger version of him, smaller, unsharpened, falling asleep to his mother's voice and the sound of words in a language that wasn't his, which had become attached in his memory to the texture of safety. "That's not a distinction you need to make," she said. He looked at her. "Liking something because of what it's attached to," she said. "That's still liking it. The feeling is real regardless of its origin." Something crossed his face. Something she was beginning to recognize as the expression he wore when she said something that rearranged a small piece of his thinking, a fractional shift in the set of his brow, a brief attending. "My mother reads to me too," she said. "Read. Past tense. I'm too old now, theoretically. But when I came home last summer, the first proper night home, she came to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and read me 3 chapters of a Muggle novel I'd loved at 11. Neither of us acknowledged that it was an unusual thing to be doing. She needed to be there, and that was the form it took. The hand beside hers shifted. Barely, a quarter-inch closer, the motion so small it might have been the stones settling. She did not look down. "What was the novel?" he asked. "The Secret Garden." His expression moved. "I know that one." "You've read it?" "My mother had a copy. Old. The cover was coming apart." He paused. "She kept it on the lower shelf of her study. I was never entirely sure whether it was meant to be there or whether it had arrived by accident, the way books sometimes do in old houses, migrating from room to room." "What did you think of it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought the garden was the most frightening thing in it. The locked place that was allowed to become wild, that everyone had agreed to stop maintaining because it was easier than facing what it meant." A pause. "I was 10, and I found that genuinely troubling." Hermione looked at him. The candlelight between them was steady, and his face in it was quietly, unexpectedly open. Not performing openness, not constructing it, simply present in it, the way faces are when the effort of management has temporarily been set aside like a wand on flagstone. "You were a strange 10-year-old, she said. The line appeared at the left corner of his mouth. It lasted longer this time. "Undoubtedly," he said. She smiled. "A real one. Not managed, not deployed, simply arriving on her face in response to something genuine." She felt it happen and didn't attempt to contain it, and she watched him register it across the 2 inches of flagstone between their hands. Watched something in his expression shift in response to it the way a compass needle shifts in response to a change in the underlying field. He looked down at their hands. Then, with the precise, unhurried deliberateness of someone who has made a decision at some depth and is following it carefully to the surface, he moved his hand the remaining 2 inches and set it beside hers so that the edge of his smallest finger rested against the edge of hers. The contact was minimal. The weight of it was not. She felt the warmth of it move up through her hand and into her wrist and somewhere along the inner surface of her arm. And she was suddenly acutely aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been a moment ago. Its pace, its location, the specific chamber of her chest it seemed to have migrated to. She did not move. "Is this all right?" he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said, equally quiet, equally serious. The rain at the window was the softest it had been all night, barely distinguishable from silence, more a memory of sound than a sound itself. The candles burned without diminishing. The carved ceiling above them held its old patience, and the half-equation on the blackboard waited for its conclusion in the warm amber dark. Hermione became aware, slowly, that she had stopped thinking about the enchantment. For the first time since the door had refused to open, since the first spell had dissolved into the wood, since she had turned and found him in this room and felt the first sharp static of his proximity, she had stopped monitoring, cataloguing, working the problem. The notebook lay on the desk above her, its 4 pages of notes face up in the candlelight, and she felt no pull toward it, no urgency. The part of her that perpetually organized and catalogued and sought the next necessary thing had gone quiet, and in its place was simply this: cold stone, warm candlelight, the edge of his finger against hers, and the particular quality of being next to someone who was fully present with you. "I owe you an apology," he said. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at their hands. "More than one," he continued. "I'm aware of that. I'm not going to attempt to cover all of them tonight, because I think doing it quickly would be—" He paused, finding the word. "Insufficient." "Yes," she said, "but there is one that I need to say specifically." His jaw moved. The silver ring pressed into the stone as his hand shifted slightly, and the pressure of his smallest finger against hers became fractionally more definite. Not a grip, not yet, simply more presence. "5th year, the Department of Mysteries corridor. What I called you, in front of—" He stopped. Hermione felt the word arrive in her memory before he could continue. She knew which moment. She had known which moment was coming from the first sentence. It was one she had carried differently from the others. Not with anger exactly, because anger had a direction, and this had never had a clean direction, had only ever been a bruise in a place she couldn't reach. "You don't have to," she began. "I do." Quietly, with a steadiness that cost him something. "I've needed to for a long time, and I've told myself it wouldn't matter, that it was too long ago, that you wouldn't want to hear it, and all of those were reasons that were actually about my own discomfort rather than yours." He lifted his gaze then, and it met hers, and she held it. "I am sorry for that specific word in that specific moment in front of those specific people. It was deliberate, and it was designed to cause the maximum damage possible, and it did. And I have thought about it with the kind of specificity that I hope counts for something, even if it doesn't change anything." The room held very still. Hermione sat with the apology and felt it settle against the bruise she had carried, and found that it did something there. Not removal. The bruise had its own history, its own permanence, but a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement that the wound had been real, given by someone who was now, here, in this specific candlelit hour, admitting the giving of it. "It counts," she said. His eyes stayed on hers. "It doesn't fix it," she added carefully, "but it counts." "I know." He didn't look away. "I'm not asking for it to fix it." "What are you asking for?" The question came out more direct than she intended, more earnest. The kind of question that reveals in the asking of it that the answer matters considerably to the person asking. He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight moved between them. "I don't know yet," he said. And it was the most honest thing she had heard him say, which was considerable given the evening they had spent. "I think I'm asking to be in the same room as you, without all of this." He gestured slightly with his free hand, meaning the space between them, meaning all the years of it. Without all of this being the first thing. She understood that. She understood it with a fullness that surprised her. "It's already not the first thing," she said. "Tonight, it hasn't been the first thing for a while." He was quiet. She watched the stillness of him, the careful management, and beneath it, the other thing, the thing that was not managed, that had been saying true things all evening with a bravery that wore no armor and called itself nothing. Then he turned his hand on the flagstone, palm up, an offering laid open in the candlelight, the old damage along his knuckles visible from above, the silver ring catching the amber glow, his fingers slightly apart and waiting with a patience that must have taken everything he had. Hermione looked at his open hand. She placed hers in it. His fingers closed around hers with the careful, deliberate pressure of something that has been decided at great depth. Not tight, not desperate, simply certain. His hand was warmer than she expected. The ring was cool against her finger, and then it wasn't, and the warmth of his palm moved through her hand and up through her wrist. And she let it. Let the warmth arrive without trying to name it or contain it or file it somewhere she could examine later. She leaned her head back against the desk behind her and looked at the carved ceiling and breathed. Beside her, closer now, the distance between them having closed by some increment she hadn't tracked, she heard him do the same. The candles burned. The rain fell. The room held them in its enormous, patient warmth, and the door remained closed, and neither of them tried it. She woke to candlelight and the sound of pages turning. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, too high and too carved, the stone beneath her too cold, the light too amber and too still. Then memory arrived in sequence. The door, the spells, the flagstone floor, his hand around hers. She was still on the floor, her back against the desk, her robes pulled around her in a way she didn't remember arranging. Someone had arranged them. She turned her head. Draco was sitting beside her, not across from her, beside her, close enough that his shoulder was perhaps 4 inches from hers. With his back against the same desk and the Rilke open across his knee, and his eyes moving along a line of text with the particular quality of concentration that belongs to people who read the way other people breathe. Necessary, unconscious, deeply private even in company. He had not noticed her wake. She had, she realized, approximately 10 seconds before he would notice, and she spent them looking at him with the specific freedom that invisibility allows. The candlelight reached him cleanly from this angle, and in it he looked. She searched for the word and found it reluctantly because it was accurate. Young. The careful architecture of his public self was absent entirely. No performance of composure, no managed distance, no calculation running visibly behind the eyes. Just a person, reading in a quiet room, in the deep hours, his pale hair falling slightly across his forehead, and his lips moving almost imperceptibly along a phrase he found worth reading twice. Then he felt her looking. She watched the awareness arrive in him, the slight adjustment of his posture, the page ceasing to move, the quality of his stillness changing from absorbed to alert. He looked up, and their eyes met, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You slept," he said. Not an accusation, not teasing, simply noting with something in his voice she couldn't immediately categorize. "You didn't," she said. "I told you. I don't." He closed the book. "You were barely 2 hours. You should sleep more." "I'm fine." "You have circles under your eyes that suggest otherwise." She touched her face without intending to, the reflexive self-consciousness arriving before she could intercept it, and then felt faintly irritated with herself for the gesture. She lowered her hand deliberately and met his gaze with the full, undeflected steadiness she had spent years developing. He looked like he was trying not to find this amusing and mostly succeeding. "The room is warmer," she said, redirecting. He glanced upward as though the ceiling might explain it. "It changed around an hour ago. I don't know why." She did. Or she had a theory she was becoming increasingly certain of. The room responded to them, to the quality of what existed between them, to its temperature and its nature and its current direction of travel. She thought of her palm in his on the flagstone, of the warmth that had moved through her when his fingers had closed, of the slow deepening of the air between them over the course of the night, and she thought, the room felt it too. She kept this theory to herself for now. "What time do you think it is?" she asked. "Late, early." He set the Rilke on the desk above them. "The castle's been quiet for at least 2 hours. Past 3, probably." She nodded. The deep hours, the ones that had their own specific quality of permission, the way conversations in them moved differently than conversations in daylight, less guarded, more willing to go where they needed to go. She had noticed this before, in her years of night library wandering, in the particular honesty of exhausted prefect rounds. The dark pressed out certain pretenses. "Can I read some of it?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the book above them on the desk. "Rilke, if you don't mind." He reached up without rising and retrieved it, turned several pages with the ease of someone who knows a text by location rather than by number, and held it out to her open. His finger rested briefly at the top of a stanza, indicating, not directing, and then withdrew. She took the book and read. The poem was about longing. Not performed longing, the kind that announces itself and expects acknowledgement, but the quieter variety, the gravitational pull towards something whose name you don't yet have, the reaching toward a presence you can feel before you can see. She read it twice, aware of him beside her, aware of the warmth of the book's cover which had been in his hands, aware of the specific density of the silence he maintained while she read. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes." "Do you have a favorite line?" He leaned slightly, barely a small inclination, and looked at the page from his angle beside her, and she felt the warmth of that proximity as a distinct atmospheric shift, the air between them acquiring a different weight, a different specific pressure. His shoulder was now perhaps 1 inch from hers. "There," he said, and his finger returned to the page, not touching, but indicating. A single line near the bottom of the stanza. She read it. Read it again. Something in her chest responded to it with a warmth she felt all the way to the back of her throat. "Yes," she said, quietly. Neither of them moved. The inch between their shoulders remained an inch. She was aware of it with a precision that seemed disproportionate to its size. The specific measurement of it, its persistence, the way it had been maintained across several minutes now, without either of them adjusting away. The distance was both too much and extremely deliberate, and she couldn't determine which of them was maintaining it, or whether it was mutual, a shared, unspoken agreement that this inch of air was the line at which the evening currently existed, and that crossing it required something neither of them had yet fully named. She handed the book back. He took it. Their fingers overlapped on the spine for a moment. Brief, warm, the pads of her fingers against the backs of his. And then the exchange completed, and the book was in his hands alone, and she placed hers back in her lap. "Tell me something else true," she said. He looked at her sideways. In profile, the candlelight made a line of him. Jaw, throat, the straight descent of his nose, the slight bow of his upper lip. She had not previously allowed herself to look at his mouth with any particular attention. She found this attention arriving now without her authorization and redirected her gaze to the middle distance. "I've used my quota," he said. But it was not a refusal. It was the kind of thing you say when you're deciding. "You haven't," she said. "I'd tell you if you had." A pause. The candle nearest them shifted in some subtle current, throwing their shadows briefly sideways and then settling them back. "I find this easier than I expected," he said, not looking at her, looking at the book in his hands, at his own fingers on the cover. "Being here, with you, talking." A pause between each sentence that felt load-bearing. "I had a version of this conversation in my head. Not with you specifically, just the conversation I was going to have eventually, with someone, about some of it." His thumb moved across the book's worn cover. "In my version, it was much more." He paused, selecting. "Structurally sound. I had it organized. And this isn't organized. Nothing tonight has been organized. Is that," she considered, "is that a problem?" He turned his head and looked at her. From this proximity, the candlelight reached his eyes directly, and they were not the color she had been calling grey in her mind. She saw now, this close, that they had other colors in them. Pale green at the inner edge, a darker ring at the outer, the kind of eyes that required proximity to see correctly. She held his gaze and said nothing further, letting the question remain. "No," he said, quietly. "It isn't." The inch between their shoulders did not change. She felt it like a held note. "I've been angry at you," she said, carefully. "This year. I don't mean, it's not the old anger. The old anger was simple. I understood exactly what it was made of and where it was pointed. This year, it's been different." "Different how?" "I've been angry at you for being..." She stopped, started differently. "For making it complicated. For coming back here and being quiet and careful and clearly carrying something very heavy and refusing to be what I'd organized you as in my mind." She pressed her palms against her knees. "I had a very functional system. 7 years of accumulated data, extremely clear conclusions. And then you came back, and you didn't fit the conclusions." He was very still beside her. "I was inconveniently inconsistent," he said. "Yes, I apologize. Don't. I'm not complaining about it." She looked at him. "I'm trying to tell you that I noticed, that I've been noticing, that it made me..." The next word took a moment to locate. "Uncertain. In a way I don't experience very often." The quality of his attention was absolute. She could feel it against the side of her face like warmth from a specific source. "What were you uncertain about?" he asked. She looked at the middle distance, at the dust on the unoccupied desks, the patient amber light, the blackboard equation with its missing conclusion. She thought about the answer she could give and the answer she should give, and whether, in this room, in these hours, those two things were still different. "You," she said. "What to do with you? Where to? What category to?" She stopped. "I'm very good at categories. It's a strength and also occasionally a limitation. And I wouldn't stay in one. You kept moving." A breath. "You kept doing things that didn't fit. Reading in the library at odd hours. Correcting a second year's potion without being asked, and then walking away before they could thank you. Sitting alone on the astronomy tower on Thursday evenings." She paused. "I walk past on my way to the owlery. I noticed." Something shifted in his expression. Something that had been carefully maintained shifted. "Every Thursday?" he said. "Most of them." A silence that had a different texture from all the previous silences. more exposed, more mutually so. "I go to think," he said. "The tower, Thursday evenings." "I know. You look like you're working something out." "I usually am." He turned the book over in his hands. "What do you think I'm working out?" She looked at him, at the careful, exhausted, quietly present person beside her, whose shoulder was still 1 inch from hers, whose hand had held hers on cold flagstone, whose mouth had said true things all night and was now asking her, in this most direct of all possible ways, whether she had been paying enough attention to read him. She had. She had been paying more attention than she'd admitted to herself until tonight. "I think you're trying to work out whether you're allowed to be here," she said. "Not Hogwarts specifically. Here, in the world, taking up space in it. Whether the person you are now has the right to exist in proximity to the things he damaged." The silence that followed this was the longest of the night. She felt him breathe beside her, felt the rise and fall of it, because the inch between them meant she could now feel the air he displaced. "Yes," he said, barely above a whisper. "You are," she said, just as quietly, aloud. She felt rather than saw him close his eyes. A brief closing, 2 seconds, 3, and in those seconds, something in the rigid, careful line of his posture became marginally less rigid. Not collapse, not even softness. Simply a fractional yielding, the kind that happens when something held under continuous pressure is allowed, for a moment, a different kind of support. When he opened his eyes, he turned his head and looked at her. And the distance between his shoulder and hers was no longer an inch. She didn't know which of them had moved. His shoulder was warm against hers through the fabric of their robes, a steady, specific warmth, and the book lay in his hands, and the candles burned above them, and the room was warmer than it had any right to be at this hour. And she was aware of his face in her peripheral vision with a completeness that made careful, clinical thought feel suddenly like an extraordinary luxury she could not currently afford. She turned her head. He was already looking at her. The distance between them, this distance, the one between their faces, measuring in something smaller than inches now, had its own specific quality of suspension, of something that had been building across hours and flagstone and cold and candlelight and Rilke and truth-telling, arriving now at its own threshold. His eyes moved just once, briefly downward, and then back to hers. And then Professor McGonagall's voice arrived through the door like cold water. "Miss Granger, Mr. Malfoy." Crisp, carrying the voice of someone who had been searching corridors and had found what she sought, and was professionally declining to acknowledge what she had interrupted. "The enchantment has registered a significant change. The door should release momentarily. I trust you are both—" A pause of extraordinary diplomatic precision. "Unharmed." Hermione pulled back. Not far. There was nowhere to pull back to, floor and desk and him. But the suspension broke and she straightened, and her hand went to her hair, tucking it back with 3 rapid, unnecessary adjustments, while her face arranged itself into something appropriately composed. Across the inch of returned space, she heard Draco exhale. "Unharmed, Professor," he said. His voice was admirably level. Only someone paying close attention would have heard the slight additional weight of control in it. Hermione was paying close attention. She pressed her palms to the floor and stood, and the cold of the room reached her properly, now that the warmth of his shoulder was no longer beside her. and she felt that absence with an acuity that was both surprising and entirely, she admitted to herself, not surprising at all. The door did not open yet. McGonagall's footsteps receded down the corridor, giving them, Hermione realized, with a sudden and specific gratitude, a moment. She looked down at Draco, still on the floor, the Rilke in his hands, looking up at her with grey-green eyes that had not yet returned to their careful, managed distance. They were still open, still present, still something she did not have a clean category for and was becoming increasingly willing to leave uncategorized. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy," she returned, a pause in which the entire night existed between them. "Thursday," he said. "On the tower." His voice was very even. "You could—" He stopped, looked at the book, looked back at her. "You walk past anyway." She felt the sentence complete itself in the space between them without either of them finishing it aloud. "I do," she said. The door, with a sound like an exhaled breath, swung open. Thursday came with low cloud and the smell of coming frost. Hermione noticed it from the breakfast table, the particular quality of the November light through the great hall's enchanted ceiling, silver grey and dense, the kind of sky that pressed down rather than opened up. She noticed it, and then noticed that she had been noticing the sky with unusual frequency since Monday, as though the weather had acquired a relevance it hadn't previously possessed. She returned her attention to her toast and the copy of Magical Bonds and Their Dissolution she had propped against the milk jug. She was not thinking about Thursday evening. She was reading. "You've read that page 4 times, Harry said from beside her. "I'm being thorough. You turned it 20 minutes ago, and you haven't moved since." She turned the page with precise deliberateness and said nothing. Across the table, Ginny and Ron exchanged a look with the unsubtle fluency of people who have known each other their entire lives. Hermione chose not to acknowledge it. She was very good at choosing not to acknowledge things when the alternative was more complicated than she had energy for before 9 in the morning. The truth was that Monday and Tuesday had been ordinary in their externals and deeply unordinary in their internals. She had attended classes, completed her assignments, participated in 2 study groups and 1 prefect meeting, eaten 3 meals per day in the Great Hall with her friends, and maintained the complete external appearance of a person whose life had not been quietly rearranged by a night on a flagstone floor. She had also, on Tuesday afternoon, passed Draco Malfoy in the Charms corridor, and they had looked at each other, and neither of them had looked away first, and the look had lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the current of students between classes had separated them, and she had spent the subsequent 40 minutes in a charms lesson genuinely unable to tell Professor Flitwick which secondary charm he had just demonstrated. She had attributed this to fatigue. She was still attributing it to fatigue, with decreasing conviction. On Wednesday, she had received a small folded piece of parchment in the library, no name on the outside. Inside, in handwriting she had never seen before, but recognized immediately. Angular, precise, the letters slightly compressed, the pen pressed hard at the downstrokes. A single line from the Rilke poem, the one he had indicated, the one that had done something to her chest when she'd read it. She had folded it back along its original crease and placed it inside her copy of Advanced Magical Theory, and had not reread it approximately 11 times. She turned another page of magical bonds. "Hermione," Ginny said, in the voice she used when she had decided that subtlety had served its purpose and the direct approach was now warranted. "Was it you or him?" Hermione looked up. "I beg your pardon." "The room." Ginny was watching her with the bright, specific attention of someone who had been monitoring a situation for some time and was now collecting data. "We thought the enchantment would hold you for maybe 2 hours before you'd both figured out how to break it. It held you all night. So, I'm asking, was it you being stubborn, or him, or both?" The table went quiet in the particular way it did when Ginny asked a direct question and everyone else decided to also want the answer. Hermione set down her book. "It wasn't stubbornness," she said, with great care. "The enchantment required something specific. It took time." "Reconciliation," Ron said. "Not unkindly. He had the expression he wore when he was feeling guilty about something and trying to determine the optimal moment to address it. It was my idea. Mostly. The room. I asked Professor McGonagall about it, and she said she'd look the other way if certain things happened in that corridor, and I'm—" He paused. "Are you angry?" Hermione looked at her oldest friend. At the ears reddening under her attention, the shoulders braced for impact, the eyes that had Harry Potter's exact quality of hoping you wouldn't be as furious as they deserved. "No," she said. He blinked. "I'm not angry." She picked up her book. "I'm going to the library." She was aware, as she left, of Harry's voice behind her, low and close to Ron's ear. That's not what not angry looks like. She permitted herself a small, private smile that she arranged into something more neutral before she reached the corridor. She spent the morning in the library and the afternoon in ancient runes, and did not think about the astronomy tower more than 4 times per hour, which she considered disciplined given the circumstances. At 5:30, she wrapped her scarf twice around her throat and took the long route to the owlery. The astronomy tower was not on the direct route to the owlery. It was not on any particularly logical route to anywhere from the 7th floor, which was precisely why its Thursday evening occupant could be reasonably certain of not being disturbed by accidental traffic. She had known this for weeks. She had known it and continued taking her longer route anyway, which she had been explaining to herself as a preference for the view from that side of the castle. The wind on the upper walkway was sharp and carried the frost smell from the morning, colder now with the late afternoon behind it. The sky had not improved, still that pressing silver, the clouds heavy and purposeful, the grounds below stripped to their winter palette of grey stone and dark water, and the black mathematics of leafless trees. She came around the corner of the walkway. He was there. Of course, he was there. She had known he would be there, which made the specific impact of actually seeing him, leaning against the parapet with his forearms on the stone, his robes dark against the pale sky, his hair moving slightly in the wind, disproportionate to the logic of the situation. He heard her footsteps, turned his head. The look he gave her was not surprised. She filed this carefully. She crossed the walkway and stood beside him at the parapet, leaving a distance between them that was neither the careful, deliberate distance of the months before the room, nor the inch of shared warmth from the flagstone floor. Something in between. something new that didn't have a precedent and was therefore being established now in the cold on a Thursday, with the frost smell in the air and the heavy sky pressing down on the both of them. "You came," he said. "I walk past anyway," she said. The line at the left corner of his mouth appeared. She had been cataloguing it for months, and she let herself register it fully now, without the footnote about not doing so. It was a good line. It made his whole face different. "How's the owl?" he asked. "I haven't sent anything." "Then why?" "Draco." His name in her mouth had become something she used deliberately now, something she chose, and she felt him register the choosing of it in the slight adjustment of his attention. "I didn't come for the owlery." The wind moved between them, lifting her hair, pressing his robes flat against him, carrying away the words the moment she said them, so that the air seemed immediately quieter. He looked at her with the grey-green eyes she now had a precise word for. Not grey, not silver, not slate. She had found the word Wednesday night, sitting with the Rilke parchment in her hand. Glacial, the colour of ancient ice when light reaches it from the side. Something preserved and deep, and, if you reached the right temperature, capable of extraordinary movement. "Then what did you come for?" he asked, quietly, genuinely. She turned to face the grounds. "I came because I've been thinking since Monday about what you said, and what I said, and what almost—" She stopped. The frost on the air reached her throat, and she felt it. About what was interrupted. He turned to face the grounds as well. Beside her, close but not touching, his forearms back on the parapet stone. "McGonagall had remarkable timing," he said, with the dryness that was, she had learned, his specific register of feeling that he couldn't yet express directly. "She did." A pause. "I think she did it on purpose." He glanced at her sideways. "She's been teaching here for 40 years, Hermione said. She knows exactly what a bound arbitration chamber looks like from the outside. She knew what the registered change meant. She gave us a moment, and then she gave us an exit." She looked at her own hands on the cold parapet. "She's more romantic than she lets on." A quiet sound from beside her, not quite a laugh. The precursor to one, brief, involuntary, quickly managed, but real. "I've been thinking as well," he said, "since Monday. About." He was quiet for a moment. A crow crossed the sky below them, purposeful and dark, heading toward the forest's edge. They both watched it. "About the fact that I have spent 2 years," he said, "being very careful. About everything. About how I occupy space, how I speak, what I allow to matter. I developed an entire architecture of carefulness." He pressed his thumb against the silver ring. "And I walked into that room on Monday and spent approximately 6 hours dismantling it piece by piece in front of you, and I haven't—" He stopped. "I haven't decided how I feel about that yet." "Frightened?" she offered, not unkindly. Profoundly. Without hesitation. The directness of it still surprised her sometimes. The way honesty, once he'd decided to practice it, came out of him without the hedging she might have expected. As though he'd learned early that half measures were more costly than the full thing. It is, as it turns out, quite exposing to tell the truth to someone. "Yes," she said. "I noticed that myself." He looked at her. "You were frightened too." "I'm still frightened." "Of?" She turned to face him properly, the wind pressing her hair sideways, the cold parapet at her back. He turned as well, and they stood facing each other in the late afternoon silver light. And she looked at him and found, with something that felt like relief and something that felt like falling, that she didn't want to be careful. "Of wanting something I haven't got a precedent for," she said. "I know how to want things that have clear outcomes, a goal, a method, a result. I know how to work towards something when I understand what it is." She held his gaze. "I don't have a map for this." "This," he said. "You." The word cost something. She paid it. Specifically, persistently, in ways I didn't plan and can't organize into anything clean. The silver light sat between them, and the frost smell was very clear, and his face was doing the thing it did when something had rearranged his thinking, the fractional shift in the brow, the attending. But deeper this time, more of him present in it. "I left something for you," he said. "In the library, Wednesday." "I know. I found it." "Did you?" "Yes." She did not make him ask the full question. Several times. The line appeared at the corner of his mouth, and this time it didn't disappear. It deepened, and something else arrived with it, a look she hadn't seen on him before, or hadn't seen directed at her. Something open and warm and frightened, and decided all at once. The face of someone who has reached the edge of their careful architecture and has elected, clearly and finally, to step off it. He lifted his hand. Slow, deliberate, the same quality of decision she had felt in the dark on cold flagstone. Each movement chosen at depth and followed carefully to the surface. His fingers reached the side of her face and rested there, at her jaw, at the curve where jaw becomes cheek, barely any pressure. The silver ring cool against her skin for one brief moment before the warmth of his palm replaced it. She let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 months. His thumb moved, barely, a single slow passage across her cheekbone, tracing the line of it with the attention of someone learning something they intend to remember. She felt it move through her with the specific intensity of something she had been braced against for a long time without knowing she was bracing, and she reached up and placed her hand over his and held it there. "I don't have a maps either," he said, very quietly. "I want to be clear about that." "Good," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "We'll make one." He looked at her for a long moment, the frost and the silver light, and the castle below them, and the crow long gone to the forest, and the Thursday sky pressing down on all of it. His hand was warm against her face. Her hand was warm over his. "Hermione," he said. Her name, just her name. In his mouth, in his voice, stripped of every year of everything it had ever carried, simply itself. Her name, said by someone who meant it as nothing except what it was. Her chest opened around it like a window. "Yes," she said, and she wasn't answering a question. His forehead came down to rest against hers. They stood like that in the cold, foreheads together, hands together, the wind moving around them with the patient indifference of weather that has no interest in human significance. And she felt his breath against her face, warm and unsteady, and she closed her eyes, and the castle held them the way it always held the things that happened inside it, absolutely and without judgment, and for a very long time. The frost came properly overnight. By morning, it had settled across the grounds in a thin, even sheet, the lake's edge crystalline, the grass stiff and pale, The stone balustrades of the upper walkways rhymed white along their northern faces. Hermione saw it from her dormitory window before breakfast and stood looking at it for longer than she intended. Her fingers curved around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she was thinking about something else entirely. Her dormitory was quiet. The other girls were still sleeping or had already gone down, and in the particular solitude of early morning, she allowed herself something she had been carefully not allowing all week. She stood at the window and thought about his forehead against hers, about the warmth of his palm at her jaw, about the way he had said her name, simply, without armor, without the weight of every year it had previously carried, and she let it be what it was, which was considerable, which was, she admitted, to the frost-covered grounds and the still grey lake and the crowless Thursday sky becoming a Friday sky, rather more than she had fully reckoned with. She dressed. She plaited her hair with hands that were steadier than her thinking. She went downstairs. He was at the Slytherin table when she entered the great hall, and she knew it before she saw him. The specific register of awareness that had been operating without her permission for months now. The atmospheric pressure of his presence in a room. The way her attention moved toward him. The way a needle moves toward north. Without drama, without decision, simply because that is what it does. She sat at the Gryffindor table and unfolded her napkin and reached for the toast, and did not look at him for approximately 4 minutes, which was, she felt, a reasonable exercise in self-governance. Then she looked. He was eating, which was still nearly 3 months into term, notable enough to register. The weeks in September when he hadn't had been one of the first things she'd noticed, had filed, had worried about without permission. Now he was eating and reading something propped against the water jug, and his hair was still slightly disordered from sleep in a way he'd have corrected an hour from now, and the morning light through the high windows caught the left side of his face and made him look. She turned back to her toast before she finished the thought. "You're doing it again," Harry said. "I'm eating breakfast." "You're doing that thing where you look at something and then very deliberately don't." She spread butter across her toast with the focus of someone diffusing something. "I have no idea what you mean." "Hermione." Harry's voice was quiet, private, for her alone. She looked at him and found not teasing, but something more careful. The expression he wore when he was approaching something he thought mattered and was trying to do it properly. "I'm glad," he said. "Whatever is happening, I wanted you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. At her oldest friend, who had watched her for 7 years and knew her better than almost anyone, and had, apparently, decided along with Ron and Ginny that the careful mutual distance between her and Draco Malfoy required someone's intervention. "You could have told me," she said, "about the room, before. You'd have argued. I would have argued very effectively." "Exactly." He smiled. It reached his eyes completely. "Are you angry?" She thought about Monday night, about cold flagstone and warm candlelight, and the slow accumulation of true things said in a room that required truth the way other rooms required air. She thought about his hand, palm up, open on the stone. About the weight of a single line of Rilke folded into a small square of parchment. About a frost-covered Thursday walkway and a forehead pressed to hers in the silver cold. No, she said, and this time she meant it entirely. She found him in the library after morning classes. Not by accident. She had looked with the specific purposefulness she usually reserved for research, and found him in the third aisle from the back, in the section on magical history, standing with a large volume open across his forearms and his head bent over it at the angle that meant he was genuinely reading rather than appearing to. His bag was on the floor beside him. His wand was hooked into his pocket rather than held, which she had come to understand as his version of ease. She came to stand beside him and looked at the page he was reading. Goblin Rebellions, she said. Binns assigned it. He did not look up. 3 weeks ago. I've been otherwise occupied. A pause that contained multitudes. In my thinking. She reached past him and turned 3 pages forward with the ease of someone who knows a text by location. The relevant section is here. He's going to ask about the 1612 uprising specifically. He looked at the page she'd indicated, then at her. You've already read it. In 4th year. The line appeared. She watched it without pretending not to. Of course you have, he said, and there was something in it, warm, specific, entirely unguarded, that pressed against her sternum from the inside. She reached for the volume she had come for, from the shelf at her eye level, and remained where she was, rather than moving to a table. Standing beside him in the library aisle with their arms occasionally proximate, and the smell of old parchment around them, and the distant scratch of other people's quills from the reading tables, felt she was discovering, like a version of something she wanted to continue indefinitely. I've been thinking, she said to the book she was opening, dangerously thorough of you. About what you said on the tower, about the architecture. She turned pages without reading them. Of carefulness. He had closed the goblin volume and was watching her with the full, direct attention that still, after a week of it, produced a physiological response she was trying to approach scientifically and largely failing. And? I don't want you to dismantle it, she said. On my account. She looked at him. I mean, I want you to say true things. I want what happened in that room to continue happening. But I don't want you to... The carefulness isn't a wall. Not all of it. Some of it is just who you are. How you're built. She held his gaze. I don't want to arrive and require you to become someone else. Even a more open version. I want the version that exists. Something happened in his expression. Something she didn't have a complete map for yet. She was building the map, had been building it since Monday, was aware of its incompleteness, and finding that incompleteness less frightening than she'd expected. He looked at her with the glacial eyes and the disordered morning hair and the wand hooked in his pocket, and said nothing for a long, specific moment. Then, the version that exists has significant flaws. I'm aware of several of them. That doesn't concern you. It concerns me considerably, she said. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. Some of what you've been, some of what happened in the years before, I won't pretend I've fully... She stopped, reorganized. But the version that exists is also the version that reads Rilke at 3 a.m. and worries about thestrals he can't see yet, and leaves folded parchment in library books, and said true things all night when he could have maintained comfortable silence. She pressed her thumb along the edge of her book's page. The version that exists is worth the concern. The library held its vast, papery quiet around them. Draco looked at her with an expression she was reading, imperfectly but increasingly, as something in the neighborhood of undone. Something come loose at a carefully maintained seam. His jaw moved once. He looked at the shelf beside her head, at the ranked spines of old volumes, at the accumulated weight of other people's knowledge organized into patient rows. And then he looked back at her, and the expression had not reassembled itself into anything safer. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, very quietly. "With this, with..." He made the slight gesture that meant us, the space between them, the Thursday walkway and the Monday flagstone, and all the accumulated weight of it. This is not territory I have maps for." "I told you," she said. "We'll make one." "You said that on the tower." "I meant it on the tower." He reached out and took the book from her hands. Not abruptly, simply, with one hand, curving his fingers around the spine and setting it on the shelf behind her without looking at it, his eyes remaining on her face. His other hand found the shelf beside her head, not caging, simply present, a bracket of him around her in the library aisle, his arm along the shelf and his face close enough that she could see the darker ring at the outer edge of his eyes, the particular color she had been working to name since Monday. "Hermione," he said. The word arrived in her chest and stayed there, warm and specific, and entirely without the weight it had once carried. "Yes," she said. The same word she had said on the tower, still not answering a question, answering everything else. His forehead came toward hers, and she thought, again, this, yes. And then his forehead didn't stop at hers. His mouth found hers with the same quality that had characterized everything he had done since Monday. Deliberate, certain, decided at depth, and followed carefully to the surface. Not tentative, not rushed. The pressure of it was warm and unambiguous, and it tasted of the morning's tea, and something underneath that she didn't have a word for, and thought she might spend considerable time investigating. She kissed him back. Her hand found the front of his robes and held there, the fabric gathered in her fingers, and she felt him exhale against her mouth. Not relief exactly, something more than relief, something that had been held under continuous pressure and was now, finally, meeting a surface that held it back instead of requiring it to hold itself. It lasted the length of a breath. 2. The library aisle held them in its parchment-scented quiet, and no one came, and no one interrupted, and the frost outside held its own, still silence, and the castle, in its enormous, patient way, simply continued around them. When she drew back, it was only by an inch, the inch that had been between their shoulders on Monday, which had felt then like a charged and deliberate territory, and felt now like almost nothing, like a measurement she might close again at any moment without planning to. He was looking at her with the undone expression still present, deeper now, and something underneath it that was new. Something lighter, she thought. Something that had not been there on Monday. She examined it and decided with the confidence of someone building a map from available data that it was something in the neighborhood of relief. Not the quiet, exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying too much and has simply set it down. The other kind. The kind that arrives when you reach something you weren't certain you would reach. "One question," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "One answer," he said, also not entirely steady. The equation on the blackboard, she said. In the room. What do you think the right side was? He looked at her. His hand had come from the shelf to her face, his thumb at her jaw in the way it had been on the tower. Learning, she understood now. Memorizing. The gesture of someone who intends to continue. I think, he said slowly, it was solving for what happens when two opposing variables reach the same temperature. And what does happen? His thumb moved across her cheekbone. The silver ring was cool, and then not. They stop opposing, he said. She felt her mouth curve. Not managed, not deployed, entirely involuntary, reaching all the way to her eyes. She felt it happen, and felt him see it happen, and felt the slight deepening of the line at the corner of his mouth in answer, and in the amber parchment-scented quiet of the library aisle on a frost-bright Friday morning, with the castle around them, and the winter outside, and the long map of what came next, entirely uncharted and entirely theirs. She reached up and covered the hand at her face with hers. We should study, she said. Probably, he agreed. Neither of them moved. The library held them in its old, knowing silence, the silence of a place that has contained 10,000 years of human reaching, of questions asked and answers found, and the long space between the two. And the frost sat on the grounds outside, and the sky was brightening, slowly, from its pressing silver into something approaching light. And Hermione Granger stood in a library aisle with Draco Malfoy's hand warm against her face, and thought, this, exactly this, and did not look for a cleaner category, and did not need one, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, did not try.
I wrote this story because I believe that the hardest thing between two people is not hate, it is silence. Draco and Hermione spent years being loud in all the wrong ways, and then they spent even more years saying nothing at all. But silence is not peace. Sometimes silence is just fear with closed mouths. This story is about a room that refused to let them hide, not from each other, from themselves, because that is a real lock. Not the door, not the magic, us. We are the thing that keeps us trapped. I wanted Draco to be broken in a quiet way, not dramatic, not performing his pain, just tired, carrying something heavy with no one to set it down with. And I wanted Hermione to be strong but not untouchable, because strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it is choosing honestly even when it costs you something. The moment she put her hand on that cold floor and left it there, that was the whole story for me. That one open hand, that one decision to stop pretending herself quiet so hard. I think we all have a locked room somewhere inside us, and I think most of us are waiting for someone worth opening it for. I hope this story felt like something real. I hope it stayed with you a little. Thank you for listening.